just how my anti-silent I hope that's the romantic goal. I don't want to sleep alone by myself, by myself. You know it's been 3 weeks, haven't got a text back. I still have the sunflower prop from when we first met. You said that you liked me, I was catching feelings. I just wanna know if you think I'm unappealing. Was I not pretty enough for your standards? Said you're clingy and drove you away. Was I starting to get too invested? I'll never see those movies the same way. Oh, and love, I just want to give up. When rejection's all I felt, it's just hell, it's just hell. My anti-silent I hope that's the romantic goal. I don't want to sleep alone by myself, by myself.
Well, that was quite the mood change. Hello! Hello, chat! How are we doing today? So, I am back in my college dorm for the semester, and I want to read the next chapter of The Stars and Their Children, because apparently the last chapter is going to be an epilogue, so basically all the shit's going down today. And boy, oh boy, am I not ready, but also so ready at the same time. I just need like one moment to like settle in for a moment, because I was kind of rushing like a minute before my stream started. Also, I should do this. There we go. A minute before stream started, I almost forgot my microphone. That would have been interesting. Alright. Before we get started though, if you're new to my stream and you enjoy the content, be sure to leave a follow, and also follow my other socials if you want. Let me type out the command. Here we go. That's the link tree to all my socials. My Discord channel, I need to renew the invite link for that, but I'll do that later if I remember. My Twitter, my TikTok, and my Instagram are all on that link. So if you want to follow me in other places, feel free to do so. Alright. Let's get on to this, shall we? I think we shall. Also, I completely didn't realize until after I ended stream yesterday that I accidentally pulled up the starting soon screen instead of the ending screen or scene or whatever it is. That's totally on me. My bad. Okay. But real quick, I'm just gonna take a drink of water. And also, if you want to see me play Omori, that's my sub goal. The Stars and Their Children is written by Bones and the Bees, such a very talented author. I highly recommend reading her other works on your own time. And also giving kudos and subscribing. I'm still not quite sure how that works, but yeah. If you don't know who Bones and the Bees is by name, you might know her from one of her more popular works, Tom Unit's Clinic for Supervillains. If you've ever been on Dream SMP Twitter or whatever Wilbur Soot's Twitter is, and if you've ever heard of the character Siren, that fic is where Siren comes from. But this is something different. Let's get started. Chapter 28. Waves falling off the edge of the world. Summary. Their time has run out. I won't waste your time. I know you want to get into the story. Just know that Dream is in this chapter. Just a warning, he features heavily in it. But again, I'm basing my characterization off of Sea Dream, so there you go. I don't see any trigger warnings, so hopefully we should be good. The only content warning would be for Dream, but yeah. It was a bad morning. To be fair, all mornings since his fight with Tommy had been bad mornings. But from the moment he woke up, the memories of explosions ringing in his ears, Wilbur knew it was going to be worse than usual. A thick fog had settled over his thoughts, and refused to let up even when he stumbled to the bathroom to splash water on his face. He didn't feel like he was attached to his own body. Instead, he was some blurred, hazy thing floating above himself. A living ghost. When he left his room to go to breakfast, he didn't speak to Jack. Thankfully, the moment he saw Wilbur's face, Jack seemed to know that he wasn't in the mood for conversation. Instead, he just led Wilbur to the dining room, throwing a worried glance back at him every few moments to make sure he was following along. The moment he stepped foot in the dining room, Wilbur cursed himself for not just taking breakfast in his bedroom. He was so out of it, he'd just gone through the routine without thinking. He forgot that he could just call for his food to be brought to him. The fog was far too thick for Wilbur to even hope to hold a conversation with Phil. But he was already there, and Phil was giving him a barely there smile, encouraging him to come sit. Wilbur didn't feel like he was the one controlling his limbs as he walked over to the table. Like someone else had taken over his body, and he was just along for the ride. Once he sat down, Phil said something to him, but his voice was muffled by the water rushing in Wilbur's ears. He stared at his plate of food, wondering why it didn't smell like anything to him. Obvious. Phil's voice finally broke through, but it was still distant. Wilbur looked up from the plate, his eyes meeting icy blue ones filled with, well, it could have been concern, but it might have been closer to confusion. Wilbur couldn't tell, and didn't have the mental energy to try and discern it further than that. Either way, Phil was looking at him very intently, and Wilbur took a breath, trying to break through the fog and listen to what he was saying. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" he asked, feeling like a stranger's voice came out of his mouth. Phil blinked. I've been speaking for the past several minutes, and did you not hear any of that? The question wasn't accusatory. No, there was no anger in Phil's voice. Even in Wilbur's disconnected state, he could tell that much. If he had been less out of it, maybe he would have thought to lie. Maybe he would have realized how insulting it looked to admit to ignoring everything Phil had said to him since he sat down. Maybe he would have been at least embarrassed. But he didn't think of any of that. It was difficult enough to come up with even a simple answer. "No," he admitted. I'm a bit tired. It wasn't him being tired. Wilbur knew that, but he couldn't figure out how to put his haze into words, especially not when the haze made words even more difficult for him than usual. Phil was silent for a moment, his brows furrowed, before something much softer settled over his face. Something Wilbur would later realize was understanding. Tired. Right, Phil murmured, nodding to himself. If you'd like to go back to your room and rest some more, you can. I'll have someone bring breakfast to you later. Although Wilbur had cursed himself for not doing that earlier, now that he was sitting at the table with Phil, he couldn't bring himself to leave, because if he went to his room, he'd lose himself in the fog, and being lost wasn't restful, not in the slightest. He didn't want to drift. He wanted to root himself back in his own body, and force his mind to wake up properly. Wilbur needed to anchor himself back in reality. The silverware he was holding was cool against his fingers, which certainly helped, but it was small. He needed a heavier anchor. He glanced down at the table again. Phil's hand was resting halfway between them. Likely by accident, but it was noticeable nonetheless. His razor-sharp talons glinted in the light of the dining room, and Wilbur found himself reaching out without even thinking about it. Phil stiffened when Wilbur took his hand, but didn't pull away. The hand was warm and solid in his own. He curled his fingers around Phil's, the tips of Phil's talons just barely poking in the palm of his hand. It helped. Wilbur focused on the hand, squeezing his eyes shut and pressing Phil's knuckles to his forehead. His body was still on autopilot, but he was able to register more of what was going on around him. The cool air of the dining room, the weight of his coat draped over his shoulders, the warm hand against his forehead. It was all slowly coming back to him. In retrospect, Wilbur wasn't sure how long he stayed like that, but he knew it was a while. And yet, Phil never pulled away. Not once. He just let Wilbur hold on for as long as he needed to. Is my mic still picking up? Good. Wilbur woke up to a gag being tied around his mouth. Before he even had a chance to register what was going on, Wilbur thrashed against the hands grabbing him out of pure instinct. He let out a muffled scream, balking as his hands flew up to the fabric on his face, trying to pull it out. Gloved hands grabbed his wrists, while another pair of hands twisted their fingers into his hair. Pain radiated through his scalp as his head was yanked backwards, an involuntary whimper bubbling up his throat as the gag was tightened and secured. Blinking fast, Wilbur's sleep-addled mind struggled to catch up with what was in front of him. Assembi soldiers surrounded his bed, dark helmets obscuring their faces as they dragged him to his feet. He stumbled, head twisting around to see his little brother suffering the same treatment as him. Tommy's eyes were wide as he thrashed against the hold the soldiers had him in. Although he was gagged, he kept trying to shout through it, but only succeeded in making muffled, angry noises. As they were pulled out of the bedroom and down the hall, Wilbur felt the waves start back up. He wasn't gasping for air. He wasn't trying to fight against them. No, he breathed the salt water in wholeheartedly, letting it burn his throat and his lungs as the roar got louder in his ears. Oh, don't worry about being late, Monkey. You didn't miss much. This bit right here was just like a dream or something from a memory that Wilbur had where he tried grounding himself with Phil's hand in the dining hall. terror and anger mixing into one. The waves swelling larger and larger as pressure built in the back of his throat. A command begging to be let out. Ice trickling through his veins, making his legs go stiff as panic filled his every cell. This had to be it. The purgatory they'd been trapped in was finally at its end. Wilbur was being walked a bit ahead of Tommy, but he kept twisting his neck to try and look back at his brother. Each time, the soldier holding on to him smacked the side of his head, but he ignored the pain echoing through his skull. He couldn't let Tommy out of his sight. While he didn't think the soldiers would separate them, he didn't know that for sure, and he wasn't going to let these be the last moments he had with his brother. Eventually, the soldier holding him must have gotten tired of smacking him in the head, because they slowed down their pace so he and Tommy could walk side by side. As soon as their shoulders brushed, the tiniest bit of ice in Wilbur's veins thawed out. Tommy was right here. Wherever they were being taken, they were going together. The halls of the palace were seemingly unchanged by their absence. Towering pillars of marble glimmered in the reflection of the pink sky outside. Their footsteps echoed off the high ceilings, creating a discordant symphony that could almost be considered a funeral song. What would their funerals be like? Did Asempi even allow funerals for those that had been executed? Or would he and Tommy's bodies be thrown into a nameless grave, destined to rot with only the silverwood trees and the twilight sky around to mourn them? Maybe Tommy would be given a funeral, a memorial for the king that never was. The citizens of Eldingvegr would grieve Tommy's loss like they'd lost a member of their own family. He was adored by both those that knew him and those who did not. It was often said that Prince Theseus was a true child of Eldingvegr itself, with golden hair reminiscent of the sands of Solcid, and eyes like ice to reflect the frigid landscape of Nutsid. With the loss of the king and queen, the planet had made him its child, and would no doubt mourn his death for a long time to come. If Wilbur was lucky, he might get mentioned when others spoke about Tommy's death, the tragedy of the heir and his brother. Maybe historians would treat him kinder than he'd been treated in life. Another unfortunate casualty in Asempi's brutal takeover. Prince Theseus Thomas Aenir was executed along his half-brother, Orpheus Wilbur City, who would have become Theseus's advisor had he ascended the throne. Although a bastard, Orpheus served his half-brother faithfully till the end, a sign of loyalty to his adoptive planet. Stop talking about that, nobody's gonna die. I hope not. Hey, there was no trigger warning death at the beginning of this chapter, so fingers crossed. And I don't think Bones and the Bees is that kind of person to forget adding trigger warnings to a chapter. So, I think we're in the clear. What would Phil say when he found out about their deaths? He would be upset, there was no doubt about that. But would it be that he was so close to winning their negotiations, only for them to run off and get themselves killed? Would it be because Dream won? No, that wouldn't be the only reason Phil was upset, and Wilbur knew that. It was just a question of how deeply he'd mourn Wilbur's death. They continued down the halls, stumbling over their own feet as the guards hurried them along. When they passed by the orrery, Wilbur's chest ached, remembering the conversation he'd had with Arid in the day before the invasion. I also like to think my duty is always included ensuring both you and Tommy are safe and whole as well. What a fucking snake. By the time they reached the doors to the throne room, Wilbur was struggling to breathe in a way that had nothing to do with his gag. His heart slammed against his ribs, begging for release. His legs were shaking so much, he would have fallen over if he wasn't being held up by a soldier. When his shoulder brushed against Tommy's again, it brought no sense of relief. It only worsened the fear, knowing that Tommy very well might have to watch him die before he was executed himself. Towering white doors, carved with intricate designs of constellations and spirals, opened on their own as soon as they approached. Wilbur's bare feet slid against the marble floor, his coat brushing the backs of his calves as he and Tommy were yanked to the front. The throne of Eldingvegr was a marvel of metal craftsmanship. Much like the orrery, it was made of a mix of gold and silver, all swirling lines and beautiful carvings depicting the history of its rise to power. The discovery of Blazafame, the subsequent battles, followed by the people being united under one seat of power that was granted the right to rule by the stars themselves. The throne was a history book in itself, and Wilbur wondered if Dream was going to destroy it, or let Eldingvegr hold on to it under his rule. Currently, the throne was empty, but the stairs leading up to it were not. "We brought the prisoners as requested," one of the soldiers said, tightening her grip on the back of Wilbur's neck. Although Wilbur had never actually laid eyes on Dream before, he immediately knew the man sitting on the steps to the throne was him. He wore a similar uniform to that of his guards, albeit one that was far more ornate. Shimmering black fabric with hints of acidic green splashed throughout, with broad shoulder pads and silver medallions pinned to his coat like badges of honor. He wore black boots that went up to his knee, and a cloak in that same painful shade of green was looped around his belt, no doubt the color of his empire. Wilbur's eyes drifted up to his face. Although he'd heard Eric point out how young Dream was during the conversation between them he overheard, it was still surprising to see how youthful the man was for himself. The only thing marring his face was a jagged scar that ran diagonal over his nose and across his cheek. A puckered pink thing that had to be years old, but still looked painful. For a brief moment, their eyes locked. Wilbur's panicked gasps fell silent, and the waves drowned out any coherent thoughts he could have had in favor of one overwhelming emotion: hate. Dream smirked when he saw the rage dancing in Wilbur's eyes. Wilbur strained against the hold the soldier had on him. "You're certain their gags are secured?" Dream asked, finally looking away from Wilbur. "Yes, Your Majesty," the soldier holding on to Tommy answered. "We tied them as tightly as possible." "Yeah, no kidding. The gag was already making Wilbur's jaw ache, and it had only been on him for a few minutes." "Good. Tie them to the chairs," Dream ordered, pointing the two wooden chairs that had been set back to back in front of the steps to the throne. Pointing to two wooden chairs that had been set back to back in front of the steps to the throne. I didn't know if I read that sentence right, so I just redid it. The soldiers nodded, and their shoulders knocked into each other again as they were guided toward the chairs. Wilbur caught Tommy's eye and tried to give him the most reassuring look he could muster, but he knew it was a futile attempt. They were both scared out of their minds, and it showed. Their hands were bound behind the backs of the chairs, while their ankles were tied to the legs. A rock dropped into Wilbur's stomach the minute he realized he couldn't see Tommy's face like this, that they might not even be granted the kindness of witnessing the other's death. However, when Wilbur moved his hand, he felt his fingers brush against another. They were barely able to reach, but Wilbur hooked his pinky through Tommy's and felt Tommy pull toward it as much as he could. The tiniest comfort imaginable, but one Wilbur was grateful for nonetheless. "They're secure," Wilbur's soldier reported, straightening up after tying his ankles. Dream nodded. "Now go take your stations outside the doors." Saluting in unison, the soldiers turned and headed out of the throne room, the doors slamming shut behind them. Dread wrapped itself around Wilbur's throat as soon as they were gone. "Well," Dream began, clapping his hands together and making Wilbur flinch. "This has been a long time coming, wouldn't you say?" he asked, glancing between Wilbur and Tommy. Both of them were silent, and Wilbur did his best not to meet Dream's eyes again. He wouldn't give him the satisfaction of witnessing his fear. Because he wasn't looking at Dream, though, Wilbur noticed movement out of the corner of his eye, and his heart sank even lower into his chest when he realized Sapnap was in the room as well. "Dream, you know we have to wait until—" "Oh, chill out. I know we have to wait for Eret," Dream said, cutting Sapnap off as the general made his way up the steps to stand beside his emperor. "Where the fuck are they anyway?" Sapnap, who was much shorter than Dream, and dressed in full armor with a sword on his hip, shrugged. "I don't know. They were informed of the scheduled time, so they must be caught up in something." Dream rolled his eyes. "Probably still getting dressed in one of those ridiculous outfits of theirs," he huffed. "Hey, don't you dare disrespect their outfit." I hate them, but don't disrespect the serf." "I hope they know that we won't wait for them forever. I want to get this done sooner rather than later. As the reigning monarch of the planet, they have to be here to sign the death warrants," Sapnap explained, raising an eyebrow at Dream. "We can always have them sign after and just say one of them tried to escape," Dream said, eyes flickering back to the brothers. He glanced between Wilbur and Tommy, a slow smile spreading over his face as his gaze settled on the still struggling Tommy. "The little one seems like the type." Tommy immediately stopped trying to wriggle out of the restraints, and Wilbur could perfectly picture the glare he was giving Dream right then. "We'll wait a bit longer," Dream continued after a beat. "After all, it's not like these two are going anywhere." The ache in Wilbur's jaw grew worse as he clenched his teeth, wanting nothing more than to curse Dream out with every insult in his repertoire. Clapping his hands again, Dream then moved off the steps and towards their chairs. "I suppose since we have time, we might as well have a bit of a chat, since we haven't really talked face to face before." He circled the brothers like a predator assessing its prey. Wilbur refused to shrink under his gaze, meeting his eyes with all the rage he could muster. Dream smirked again. "In case no one explained it to you, you've been found guilty of conspiring to assassinate me," Dream began, his steps echoing off the cavernous walls. "It was a half-baked plot that involved you two sneaking back onto the planet and using your voices to take out soldiers on the way. But it was a doomed mission from the start. A fool's errand devised by two children thrown into a game they're not prepared for. Something only idiots would do." Behind him, Wilbur felt Tommy tense. "I'll admit, when I received the call from Sapnap telling me he'd captured you two on your own, I almost thought it was a trap. That the Antarctic Empire had sent you out of the atmosphere as bait, and Sapnap's ship was about to be raided by Antarctic soldiers. He paused, laughing to himself and shaking his head. It just didn't make sense. If you had gone to any other planet, I would have hunted you down and killed you, destroying anyone that stood in my way. But I have to give you both credit, because you went to the one place I couldn't follow. Even if they'd sought refuge on another planet, Dream would have followed them. If Wilbur had given into Tommy's protests when they first escaped and tried to hide out on an outer sector planet, they probably would have been dead in weeks. Era was right. Zephyrus 4 was the safest place for them. Hold on, I got an email. Where's my mouse? There it is. It's just an email from my psychology professor. Anyway, I'll take this time for a drink break, because my throat's a bit dry. Oh, and there goes my phone. I just knocked my phone off my lap. How genius of me. There we go. Eric was right. Zephyrus 4 was the safest place for them. I'm not the kind of man that admits to weakness, but I can't lie. When Princess Marina told me that you two were in the midst of negotiations with Emperor Filza, I was worried. While I don't doubt the strength of my military, Sapnap flashed a self-satisfied smirk at this. The Antarctic Empire has us outnumbered. Fending off an invasion from them would be costly, if not impossible. So I kept my eyes on the planet constantly, because if they launched military ships at any point, we would need all the time we could get to prepare for war. Instead of an invasion, though, we got you two. Sapnap chimed in, folding his arms over his chest. Again, I thought it was a trap, because it seemed too good to be true. You two leaving Zephyrus 4 completely alone, in the same exact shuttle you stole to get there? It was pathetic. Pathetic and so fucking easy, Dream exclaimed, his smile having turned manic. But it wasn't a trap. You're just idiots. The anger was simmering behind his ribs, waves crashing over and over again in his gut. Everything tasted like salt water now, and Wilbur wasn't sure if he wanted to cry or scream. The pinky he had wrapped around Tommy's was trembling now. With anger or fear, he wasn't sure. Still, he didn't let go, and neither did Tommy. Why did you do it? Why did you leave? Dream asked, raising an eyebrow at Wilbur. Did you two not get along with Filza and Technoblade? Were they too mean to you? His voice turned high-pitched and mocking, and Wilbur strained against his ties. A beat passed, like Dream was waiting for a response. Then he laughed again. Oh, right! You can't answer me, he taunted, circling their chairs again. When I was planning the invasion, Eric warned me that you could use your voice, Orpheus. And I gotta admit, that's pretty impressive. Dream stopped in front of Wilbur's chair, leaning down so they were face to face. It wasn't just Wilbur's hands that were trembling now. No, it was his entire body, and he knew this time that it was pure, unfettered rage. Dream was so close. If the gag wasn't in his mouth, he'd take a page out of Tommy's book and try to bite the piece of shit. I mean, everyone knows the Themesians don't teach men how to use the siren voice. But you two aren't even full siren. You're only half. I didn't even know it was possible for half sirens to use their voices until Eric told me. So I knew I had to take measures for that right off the bat. He straightened up again, moving around to Tommy's side. But then to find out that Theseus can use his voice as well? When everything I'd heard about him told me he was just a spoiled, bratty child? He laughed again, and Wilbur felt more than saw Tommy's flinch. That was more than unexpected, because you kept that even from Eric. So I'll give you credit where credit's due. That created far more problems for us than we were expecting. Suddenly, there was the sound of the doors opening again. Fear jolted through Wilbur like he'd been stabbed, but when he turned his head, he was both relieved and upset by who he saw walking in. I was told to deliver these for the executions, Tubbo stammered where he was standing by the door, a metal tray shaking violently in his hands. The tray itself had several items on top of it. A dark cloth bag, a vial of blazophane, and a curved dagger whose blade glittered with every shade of the rainbow, as if it was made entirely of prisms. Somehow, Wilbur's heart dropped even further than it already had, because even though he'd never been witness to a traditional execution before, he knew those were all the items required for it. The fact that Tubbo had been the one ordered to deliver the tray was a level of cruelty Wilbur could barely even comprehend. It was so obvious that Tubbo was one slight breeze away from falling apart. All the color had drained out of his face, and his knuckles were white from gripping the tray as tightly as he was. As tightly as he was. He didn't look in his or Tommy's directions as he made his way over to Dream and Sapnap, and Wilbur couldn't blame him. Even still, his chest ached when he felt Tommy shudder behind him, and wondered if his brother was fighting back tears. "Oh, right, the execution rites Eric mentioned," Dream muttered, gesturing for Sapnap to take the tray from Tubbo. "I have no fucking clue what to do with these things, so if Eric doesn't show up soon..." Before Dream could finish his sentence, there was the sound of clattering as the tray dropped to the floor. Then Tubbo let out a strangled scream, launching himself at Dream with his hand curled around the glimmering dagger. "Oh, Tubbo. Oh, Tubbo, you poor soul. Why would you try that? These are two very, very well-known in fighting soldiers. Listen, I applaud your efforts, but this is not gonna go well." It all happened so fast. One moment, Tubbo was trying to stab Dream. The next, Tubbo shouted as he was shoved back, the dagger clattering to the floor by his feet. Well, what do we have here?" Dream mocked, fingers twisted into the front of Tubbo's shirt. "Was that an assassination attempt?" Holy shit. Tubbo had attacked Dream. Tubbo had attacked Dream in front of his own general to try and help Wilbur and Tommy. Wilbur's throat threatened to close up on him, because Tubbo still cared. He never stopped caring, and it was so obvious he desperately wanted to fix what he'd done. But now he was in just as much danger as they were. Tubbo clawed at the hand Dream was using to hold on to him, making strange choking noises as Dream lifted him onto his tiptoes. Do we have to have a trial for this one? Or can we just kill him?" Dream asked Sapnap, making Tommy jolt. "Fuck you!" Tubbo forced out between gritted teeth. At the same time, Tommy screamed through his gag. Before Dream could respond, the door to the throne room opened again, and another unexpected face ran into the room. Your Majesty, I was told to... Wait, Tubbo? Like Aerith and Tubbo, Foolish didn't seem very different from the last time Wilbur had seen him. His gold-streaked hair was cut shorter than before, and he held dark circles under his eyes, the same as Aerith, but otherwise didn't look any worse for wear. You know this boy? Sapnap asked, resting a hand on the hilt of his sword. Foolish nodded, eyes blown wide as he glanced between Tubbo struggling in Dream's grip, and Wilbur and Tommy tied to their chairs. Yeah, he's Aerith's personal servant. Dream huffed. Well, Aerith's personal servant just tried to stab me. Immediately, Foolish's eyes fell to the dagger by Tubbo's feet. Look, you gotta understand, he's just a kid, Foolish quickly said, walking over to where Tubbo was still clawing at Dream's hand. He tried to assassinate the Emperor, Sapnap pointed out, his voice tight. I know, but come on, man, he's 15, Foolish argued, hands hovering like he wanted to grab Tubbo by the shoulders and yank him away from Dream. Plus, like I said, he's Aerith's personal servant. Any punishment should be cleared with them first. Tubbo had stopped fighting now, instead going limp in Dream's grip as he struggled to stay on his tiptoes. We can't just... Sapnap, Dream said, cutting his general off. We can deal with the servant later. I'd rather focus on the princes. A beat passed between the three men. The tension in the air was so thick, Wilbur could practically see it coiling around Foolish, Dream, and Sapnap. Then, Sapnap nodded and dropped the hand on his sword. At the same time, Dream let go of Tubbo, and his legs gave out immediately. The only reason he didn't collapse to the ground was because Foolish grabbed him before he could. Foolish grabbed him before he could. I'll keep an eye on him, Foolish reassured, hoisting Tubbo over his shoulder like he was a sack of flour. No! You can't! Foolish! Stop them! Tubbo shouted, slamming his fists into Foolish's back. They're gonna kill Wilbur and Tommy! Wait, hold on. That didn't sound right. They're gonna kill Wilbur and Tommy! Foolish flinched at this, but kept his eyes on Dream and Sapnap to avoid looking at either him or Tommy. Fuck you! I also have a message from Aerith, Foolish continued, ignoring Tubbo's protests. They apologize for running late, but they're unexpectedly delayed. They're requesting you wait until they can arrive, though, before going through with the execution. Unexpectedly delayed? Wilbur didn't hope. He didn't dare let himself hope. But a small part of him in the very back of his mind began to wonder if it was possible. If there was more going on to Aerith's absence than what met the eye. What's taking them so long? Dream demanded, throwing his arms out in exasperation. Like, how hard is it to walk across the goddamn palace for an execution? I don't know the details. I was just told to deliver the message. Foolish shrugged, his grip on Tubbo not faltering despite the fact that Tubbo had started kicking. Sighing, Dream dragged a hand down his face before meeting Foolish's eyes again. Fine, but tell them to hurry the fuck up, because we're not gonna wait forever. I'll pass it along. Foolish nodded. He turned to head back towards the door, but paused for the briefest of moments, locking eyes with Wilbur. The eye contact couldn't have lasted for more than a second. but it felt like eons as Wilbur witnessed the mix of grief, regret, and something deeper than either of those flash through Foolish's gaze. And then the moment was over. Foolish hurried towards the door, Tubbo no longer kicking but yelling obscenities the whole way down. "No! You can't leave! Please, Foolish, don't let them do this!" The doors creaked as it opened once more, and Tubbo's voice faded out as he and Foolish disappeared back down the hall. And just like that, they were gone. Just like that, the timer was back on. Hold on, what in the world? Why does it say... Hold on. There's been no issue with the Ethernet before. Why suddenly now? Besides, it was working earlier, I think. At least I have Wi-Fi. Anyway, I needed more water anyway. What an annoying interruption to our conversation, Dream said as soon as the door had shut. He folded his arms over his chest, glancing down at the cloth bag and vial of Blazophane lying on the floor where Tubbo had dropped the tray. Then, he crouched down, putting the vial of Blazophane in his pocket before handing the cloth bag to Sapnap. "What's in that?" Sapnap opened the top of the bag, peering in with narrowed eyes. "It looks like ash." Sulfurwood ash. In Eldingvagrian tradition, the treatment of a body for funerals usually involved smearing a mixture of ash and Blazophane on their foreheads as a way to signal that they were rejoining the soil of Eldingvagr itself. In modern day, only those living on the furthest edges of the Rook Ring practiced this still, with the only exception being in the cases of formal executions because of how rare they were. The difference with executions, though, was that the ash and Blazophane was to be applied to the guilty parties before their deaths, not after. This was supposed to act as a blessing of sorts, and a reassurance to the damned. But Wilbur couldn't explain that to Dream and Sapnap because he was gagged. If Eret truly was running late, they would explain the traditions as soon as they arrived. Eret wasn't here, though, and nausea crawled up Wilbur's throat as Dream picked up the dagger Tubbo had tried to stab him with off the floor. "You know, it's kind of ironic that a whole host of annoyances crop up when I'm gonna execute you," Dream said, testing the weight of the dagger in his hands. "It's kind of fitting, I guess. You two have been nothing but annoyances since I took over this planet." He ran his finger along the shimmering blade, holding it up to the light to admire the rainbows dancing in the facets. "It would have been so much easier if you had just died in the invasion like you were supposed to. We wouldn't have had to put together this bullshit trial. I wouldn't have had to spend so much time worrying about being invaded by the Antarctic Empire. It would have been so easy. But no. You both had to go and make my life as difficult as possible." Dream strolled over to Tommy, considering him for a moment, before walking around to stand in front of Wilbur. The dagger was still in his hand. Wilbur's breathing hitched when Dream placed the tip of it against his throat. "I blame you for that, Orpheus," Dream said, his manic smile having returned. I doubt Theseus would have escaped on his own. I also doubt it was his idea to go to Zephyr's 4 for protection. Am I right about that? Dream moved the tip of the blade away from Wilbur's throat, waiting for an answer. After several long seconds stretched between them, Wilbur nodded. You see, that's what pisses me off more than anything else, Dream explained, moving the dagger again so it was resting under his chin. The fact that it was you causing me all these problems. Not Theseus, the heir to the throne, but you, a nobody, a bastard. He paused, and the dagger pressed harder against his throat. I could have your head for that. Wilbur stopped feeling the pinky he had hooked with Tommy's long ago, but the rest of his hand ached with the urge to curl into a fist. It's honestly frustrating that I even had to hold a trial for you, Dream then continued, moving the dagger away to circle around them again. Theseus, yeah, I get it. I have to hold a trial to execute the crown prince, blah blah blah. But who even cares about the bastard prince? You don't have any claim to the throne. Technically speaking, you don't even have a claim to live here. But here you are, still flying around my head like an annoying bug. Tommy slammed his back against the chair, trying to shout more obscenities through the gag. It all just came out as muffled screaming, though, and Dream rolled his eyes. What? You don't like when I call Orpheus a bug? Dream asked, strolling over to face Tommy. You don't get it, Theseus. In a more poetic version of this story, Orpheus wouldn't be a player at all. I would have found you during the invasion, and we would have had our confrontation before I killed you. Just you and me, like it was supposed to be. The history books would say you were killed by accident in all the chaos of the invasion, and it would be considered an honorable death. Hold on. I'm so confused by this Ethernet thing. I want to try and see what the issue is. Maybe my bed is pressed too far up against the cord? No, that's not it, I don't think. No, that's not it. Okay, where's the Ethernet cord here? Okay. Okay, let me try unplugging it and plugging it back in. I don't think that did anything. Yeah, the Ethernet popped up for just a moment and then disappeared. That's so strange. I'm gonna have to ask an RA about it later. I just don't know why it's not working. Weird. Anyway. Even though he couldn't see it, Wilbur knew exactly the twisted up scowl Tommy was giving Dream right then. You don't get that now. Your death won't be remembered as something honorable, he continued, stepping closer to Tommy. You're being put to death for conspiracy against an emperor. You were likely forced to do it by your half-brother in a sad, pathetic attempt for the throne. It's an unfortunate end for both you and Orpheus, especially since you came so close to actually posing a threat to me. Dream pulled back from Tommy, strolling to a spot where he was in view of both of them. I don't know what happened with the Antarctic Empire, but I must say, you'd have to be an idiot not to accept their help. Dream was still grinning like a madman, and Wilbur bristled at the reminder of everything that went wrong. I'm not sure what's more embarrassing, the failed assassination plot story, or the truth of it all. That you had a chance to get Emperor Phil's help, and you fucked it up. He twirled the dagger in his hands, eyes settling on Tommy, before flickering to Wilbur again. I hope your tarnished reputation was worth the extra months you got before your deaths. Was it worth it? Wilbur thought back to the day they escaped Eldingvegger in that shuttle. He thought back to his overwhelming panic as he tried to decide where to go. He thought back to the shivers that ran down his spine the first time he met Phil. He thought back to every threat, every game, every power play the two shared. Then he thought back to the fight with Tommy, to the way his entire world felt as though it had been razed to the ground when he heard the word bastard leave Tommy's lips. He thought of holding on to the front of Phil's cloak. He thought of wings wrapping around him like a shield. And then, he thought of the moment it hit him. When Phil's words cracked through a layer of glass he hadn't even realized was there, and forced him to acknowledge a truth he thought he'd known. He deserved better. Why does it say no internet? What about set as metered connection? I didn't have to do this when I packed up my PC before. Hold on, this is really bothering me. I don't know what's going on. Whatever. It might just be like a I have to restart my PC thing, which I'm not gonna do until after stream. God damn it. I'm really bothered about this, and I shouldn't be, but I am. Anyway. It just bothers me seeing the Wi-Fi symbol at the bottom instead of the Ethernet symbol. Okay, what if I unplug it from the other end? Maybe that's the issue. I don't know what I just pulled. Oh, it was my phone. 1 second. I'm sorry. This is really bothering me. I can't see shit. I'm turning the light back on. swear to God. If it's because of something in this fucking building, I'm going to lose my shit. What the fuck am I supposed to do? This is bullshit. Why can't I fix this? I'll just try not to look at the bottom of my screen, or else it's gonna bother me even more. Even if he was going to die now, Wilbur couldn't bring himself to regret the time he'd spent on Zephyr's 4. Despite the fights, despite the betrayal, it had been worth it. Where the fuck is Eret? Dream suddenly groaned, dragging his hands down his face. I'm sick of waiting around. Let me ask one of the other guards if they know. As he moved to touch his earpiece, Sapnap was cut off by the sound of a distant explosion. His eyes went wide. Dreams did too. Suddenly, Sapnap was slamming his hand against his earpiece. Someone tell me what the fuck that was! There was another explosion, louder this time, and all the blood drained out of Sapnap's face. It was then Wilbur realized there was noise coming from outside the throne room doors. Although it was muffled, after concentrating on it for a few moments, it was easy to figure out what it was. Screaming. We're under attack, Sapnap whispered. What? Dream exclaimed, head snapping towards the doors. By who? Have they landed any ships yet? I thought George was surveying the airspace. Give me a fucking second! Sapnap shouted, wincing as he kept his hand on his earpiece. Can you hear me? What's going on out there? How many ships are there? Another explosion. This time, it sent a shockwave through the walls, making Sapnap and Dream both stumble. The screaming outside the doors was louder now. Soldiers barking commands as others shouted in pain. Wilbur's heart was racing as hope blossomed in the back of his mind. Maybe this was it. Maybe they wouldn't die today. Oh no, I'm not making this mistake again, Dream suddenly said, shoving the dagger into Sapnap's hands. Kill them both, now! Wilbur's blood froze in his veins as he pressed himself against his chair, desperately trying to get as close to his brother as he could. Sapnap glanced between the brothers, before looking out at the throne room doors. The screaming was getting worse. He winced and brought his free hand up to his earpiece again. Sapnap! I can't! Sapnap shouted, shoving the dagger back into Dream's hands. My soldiers are being slaughtered out there! He turned to the doors, but Dream grabbed his shoulder before he could move. Sapnap, as your emperor, I'm ordering you to execute these two! There was a beat as Sapnap considered it. He glanced between the dagger and the brothers, before gritting his teeth and pushing Dream's hand off of him. If you want them dead so badly, fucking do it yourself, Sapnap hissed. Then, he shoved Dream back and rushed down the steps to the throne room doors. The doors opened only a crack as Sapnap darted out, a wave of shouts and screams slipping inside. As soon as it shut, the sounds were muffled again, but it was enough to let Wilbur know there were a lot of soldiers out there. His head snapped back to Dream. The dagger was still in his hands, and he was glancing between Tommy and Wilbur like he was trying to decide which one to kill first. He locked eyes with Wilbur, and Wilbur's heart sank. "I'm not letting annoying bugs fly around my head any longer," Dream shouted as he pressed the blade to Wilbur's throat. Wilbur couldn't breathe. The waves were deafening, crashing over and over again as saltwater filled every cell in his body. The blade was cool against his skin, and he tried to focus on the warmth of Tommy's pinky hooked with his. And then, slam! Dream leapt back at the sound of something heavy slamming against the throne room doors. Wilbur's head snapped towards them just in time to hear it again. The doors buckled, but held strong, apparently having been locked by Sapnap on his way out. For solid 2 seconds, all Dream could do was stare at the doors in shock. Then, he ran to Tommy. He let out a muffled shout, but could only watch as Dream positioned himself behind both their chairs, holding the blade against Tommy's throat. A hostage situation. As soon as Dream had pressed the knife to Tommy's skin, the throne room doors burst open. And for the first time, Wilbur was relieved to see a flash of pink hair. "Don't come any closer, Technoblade!" Dream shouted, pulling Tommy's head back by his hair to expose his throat. "I'll slit his throat right now!" In the doorway, Techno froze. He was dressed in blue and black armor, nearly half of his braid already having fallen loose. Blood, stark red against his skin, was splashed across his face and stained the battle axe in his hands. Right then, he looked every inch the deadly imperator he was supposed to be. He looked more than dangerous. He was downright lethal. Behind him, there was a battle raging on. Asempi and Antarctic soldiers went head to head, and given the amount of acid green cloaks laying on the ground, it was pretty obvious who was winning. "You don't want to do that, Dream," Techno called out, the warning clear in his voice. "And why not? You'll kill me if I do?" Dream challenged, a manic laugh bursting from his chest. "You're already gonna kill me. Why the fuck shouldn't I take the brat out before I go?" Struggling against his restraints again, pain laced up Wilbur's arms as the skin around his wrists was rubbed raw. Still, he tried, but his restraints were too tight. "If you let him go, I'll give you a quick death. But if you kill him..." Techno paused, gold eyes narrowing. "I'm gonna paint the walls of this room with your blood." A shiver ran down Wilbur's spine at the thread. It seemed to startle Dream too, considering the way his hands had started to shake. "Fuck you, Technoblade! Either tell your soldiers to retreat right now, or you're gonna be painting the walls with both mine and Theseus's blood." Dream shot back, pressing the blade closer to Tommy's throat. For a moment, Techno was silent. He just stared at Dream, almost as if he was waiting for something. It was only then that Wilbur's panicked mind realized that he didn't know where Phil was. Dream seemed to have the same realization just a second too late, because in a blur of black feathers, Dream was knocked away from Wilbur and Tommy, head slamming against the marble as Phil tackled him to the ground. The knife clattered to the marble. A small drop of blood stained the rainbow blade, but nothing more than that. "I think we'll have plenty of blood from just you, mate, Phil said, pining Dream to the ground by his wrists. How's that sound? Dream narrowed his eyes. We didn't even get an alert about your ships. How did you get on the planet without us finding out? At this, Phil smiled, his talons digging into Dream's wrists and making the younger man wince. You should never trust a traitor, Dream. The realization hit Dream and Wilbur at the same time. Arid, Dream whispered. Congrats on being a damn idiot, Phil taunted, his smile cruel as the talons in Dream's wrists began to draw blood. There was another flash of movement in the corner of Wilbur's eye, and he jolted when he saw Puffy and Techno both rushing over to Dream and Phil. Now, if you'll excuse me, we're gonna figure out what to do with you later, Phil said, handing Dream off to Puffy as she bound his wrists together. I need to talk to my boys. And just like that, Puffy was dragging Dream out of the room. The battle outside was still raging, but it was beginning to slow as more and more Sempi soldiers fell. Wilbur watched her tie a gag around Dream's mouth, before grabbing the doors and letting them slam shut again behind her. Phil grunted as he pushed to his feet, wings arched over him and talons stained with blood. Techno offered an arm, but Phil swatted it away, brushing his own armor off before turning to face Wilbur and Tommy. A part of Wilbur was relieved. Dream was gone. No one was holding a knife to Tommy's throat anymore. For all intents and purposes, they were saved. But were they? Another part of Wilbur refused to believe it. He couldn't believe it was over just like that, because Phil and Techno were here, and they were covered in other people's blood. They'd saved Tommy and Wilbur's lives, but had they really? Maybe it was rational, but Wilbur couldn't believe it was okay. Not yet. The last time he'd seen Phil and Techno, he betrayed them. He used his voice on both of them and fled Zephyr's 4 with Tommy at his side. They had to be furious with the brothers, and Wilbur was terrified to find out what the consequences of his actions were going to be. Phil walked over to Wilbur, an unreadable expression cast over his face. They locked eyes for a moment, Wilbur's chest still rising and falling with rapid, panicked gasps. Then, he reached up, and the gag wrapped around his mouth fell to the floor. Wilbur opened his mouth for a moment, wincing at how sore his jaw was. He took another breath. Orpheus. Untie us! Wilbur commanded, cutting Phil off. Immediately, both Phil and Techno's eyes glazed over as they knelt down to undo his and Tommy's restraints. The ties around their ankles fell to the floor, and then their wrists. As soon as they were free, Wilbur grabbed Tommy's hand and tried to get to his feet, but fell to the floor when his legs collapsed out from under him. Being tied to a chair for that long really wasn't good for blood flow. Without thinking, Wilbur cried out, dragging Tommy along the ground and towards the wall. It was a frenzied scramble, like cornered animals trying to escape the slaughter. Wilbur's thoughts were racing far too fast for him to make sense of what was going on. All he could think was, we could still die, we could still die, we could still die, we could... They both put their backs to the wall, cowering against it under the weight of Phil and Techno's stares. Wilbur wrapped his arms around his brother, eyes burning at the fact that he was able to hold Tommy again. He could feel Tommy's panicked heartbeat fluttering against his chest, and he wanted to cry with relief that his heart was still beating at all. Neither one could feel their pinkies. Still, they held each other's hands in a death grip that was tight enough to bruise. You didn't have to command us. We were gonna untie you anyway, Techno suddenly said. Wilbur jumped, head snapping towards the Imperator. He and Phil were standing only a few feet away, hands stretched out like they were trying to soothe wild animals. And right then, maybe they looked a bit like animals, with their pupils blown wide and clinging to each other like they were going to be ripped apart at any moment. It was too much. The blood on Phil and Techno's clothes, the blood in the air, the blood outside the throne room doors. Too much blood. His heart was just about beating out of his chest, the waves slamming into him one right after the other. His head was spinning and his lungs were burning. When Phil took another step towards them, his breathing hitched, the panic only getting worse. Don't come closer! Wilbur shouted. It was supposed to be a command. His voice was supposed to echo across the walls, freezing Phil and Techno in place like before. But he couldn't silence the waves, not when they were this loud, not when there was just too much going on. Instead of stopping, Phil held his hands up higher, with Techno doing the same. They both took careful steps towards them, and Wilbur tried to press himself further back against the wall. Tommy was crushing his hand, but he refused to pull away. He couldn't. It's okay, Phil said softly, crouching down in front of them. Out of the corner of his eye, Wilbur saw Techno kneel beside Tommy. We're not gonna hurt you guys. Yeah, fucking right, Tommy gasped out, somewhere between a laugh and a sob. You already have. Phil winced at this, while Wilbur heard Techno sigh behind him. That's... Look. You don't need to be afraid of us, Phil insisted. It's all right. You're safe now. Now it was Wilbur's time to let out a bitter laugh. Safe? Really? He forced down a sob, still struggling to breathe properly. What the fuck happens now, then? To Eldingvegger? What makes us safe? A heavy silence hung between them as Phil shared a look with Techno. His mouth pressed in a thin line. The seconds ticked on, Wilbur and Tommy's breath still stuttering in staccato. You want to know what happens next? Phil asked, meeting Wilbur's eyes again. No matter what, Eldingvegger belongs to the Antarctic Empire now. In a few hours, we'll start shipping all the Assempi soldiers off the planet, and we'll get to work establishing our own soldiers here to ensure a smooth transfer. So that was it. After all those months agonizing over negotiations, Eldingvegger belonged to the Antarctic Empire. There was nothing to sign, no terms to work through. It was over. As for you two, Techno continued, distracting Wilbur from the burning in his eyes, you have a choice to make. Immediately, both Wilbur and Tommy tensed. A choice? Tommy questioned. Yep, a choice. Phil nodded. We understand that we never got around to finishing our negotiations, and you might not want to stay on an Eldingvegger that's under our control. And if you don't want to stay here, we're not holding you prisoner. We can load you up with a ship full of supplies, and you can go wherever in the galaxy you want. I'd recommend an outer sector planet so Dream won't find you, but we won't hunt you down. Be free to live your lives how you please. leaving? It wasn't an option Wilbur thought they'd be given. The choice to just leave Eldingvegger entirely. They wouldn't get their planet back, but they wouldn't have to stay under Antarctic rule either. They could put all of this behind them. We could be the two of them. Alone. For some reason, that sounded like the worst outcome he could imagine. What's the other option? Wilbur asked, his chest aching at the idea of leaving his whole life behind. There was the faintest hint of a smile on Phil's face as he met Wilbur's eyes again, before his gaze flickered to Tommy. Theseus, he began, making Tommy stiffen. You might be young, but you're so much smarter than I think anyone gives you credit for. You are constantly underestimated, but Techno and I both agree, as a king, you could be a force to be reckoned with. You're also one of the most talented fighters I've ever trained. Techno chimed in, resting a hand on Tommy's arm. I don't say that lightly. You have natural intuition that takes years for most soldiers to develop. He paused, moving his hand up to Tommy's shoulder. But you're inexperienced, both with fighting and as a leader. Humming, Phil nodded in agreement. Our goal with taking over Eldingvegger isn't to run it into the ground. We're not going to drain your planet of its blazophane to fill our own pockets in the short run. Instead, we want it to flourish. You're already at the seat of an economic powerhouse. We want to make sure it stays that way, and only grows stronger. Eldingvegger needs protection, Techno added. Sempi's invasion proved that it can be won. If we don't take Eldingvegger into the Empire, you would become the biggest target in the galaxy. Theseus, Phil jumped in, with our help, you could become one of the greatest kings Eldingvegger has ever had. Tommy was silent, his breathing slowing down as the tension began to leak out of his shoulders. Suddenly, Phil's eyes flickered to Wilbur, and his heart skipped a beat in his chest. And Orpheus, he began, something warm curling around his voice. You are so young, but so powerful, so overlooked by everyone around you. I never understood the obsession royals have with blood, but those frustrations only grew when I met you. Anyone who looked at you and only ever saw a bastard was a fool, because you are so much more than that. He paused, flashing him a small smile. When you used your voice on me in the hangar, I wasn't just shocked. I've never felt so completely and utterly helpless in my life. And you did that to me. The entire time you'd been on Zethus 4, you never gave that up. Not once. You lied when you translated those Themesian texts, didn't you? Techno chimed in, raising an eyebrow at him. His heart was pounding in his chest in time with the waves that were still washing over him. He nodded once, before looking back at Phil. Phil's smile grew. You led us to believe half-sirens didn't even have the ability to use their voices. You held that card so close to your chest. It wasn't something either of us even considered until we were in that hangar, unable to move. And all I could think of was how proud I was of you. So he was right. That was pride he saw in Phil's smile that day in the hangar. You were raised to be your brother's advisor, but you could be so much more than that, Phil continued, his voice soft. That doesn't mean you have to leave your brother behind, but you can stretch your wings. You can reach for something more, and I know you can make it. He paused again, reaching out to rest a hand on his cheek, and Wilbur wanted nothing more than to lean into the warmth. "You're already something great," Phil whispered. "You just have to let yourself be." And Wilbur wanted to believe it. He wanted to believe it so bad. The warmth was a dark and needy thing twisting and clawing inside his chest. It was wanting to be recognized as more. It was wanting the potential inside of him to be seen. It was wanting someone to believe in him. Wilbur's voice cracked, and he took a breath to try and steady himself, the waves in his mind finally beginning to slow. "Was any of it real?" he whispered. "The things you told me? The affection? Were you just trying to manipulate me?" And Phil's smile faded at this, pulling his hand back, but he didn't seem angry at the question. If anything, the look on his face was closer to understanding, along with the same pride still shining underneath it all. "In the beginning, yes, it was a manipulation tactic. I was trying out several things, from intimidating you to challenging you, because I was interested to see how you'd react. And then I switched things up, trying to come off like I understood you so you'd be more willing to trust me. That's why we were using Rambo. So we could learn more about how you two were doing and use it to our advantage." He paused, as if he was struggling to find his own words. "I don't know when it switched, but at some point, I realized it wasn't a tactic anymore. I genuinely wanted to help you and see you grow into the best version of yourself. So yes, it was real." Wilbur couldn't breathe again. His throat was closing up, tears blurring his vision because that had been what he wanted to hear for so long. And yet, "How am I supposed to trust you?" he asked in a broken voice. "How do I know we aren't just playing another game? That this isn't another tactic you're trying out?" Tommy squeezed his hand as a silent reminder he was there. Wilbur tightened the arm he had wrapped around Tommy's middle. "Orpheus, you have a voice," Phil pointed out after a long moment of silence. "Use it." He was telling him to use his voice. Phil was granting him permission to use his voice on him to see if he was telling the truth. The waves had finally settled themselves in Wilbur's head enough for him to breathe. He shut his eyes, counting each wave as it rolled in and out, letting his heartbeat slow even further. Then, "Are you telling me the truth?" The command was weak, far weaker than Wilbur's voice normally was, and he knew it was because of how he was barely holding himself together. But it still echoed deep in his bones, and even though it scraped painfully against his throat, he was relieved to hear it work. "Yes," Phil answered immediately. "Everything I've said is the truth." "Oh." There was another question Wilbur needed to ask, one that he was terrified of even putting into words, because the moment he did, there was no going back. It was putting a name to the thing he swore he'd never say out loud, because it has always seemed impossible. But Phil cared, and Wilbur once thought that was impossible. So maybe, just maybe, this wasn't impossible either. You once told me that little bird was a nickname parents on Elytra used for their children. Wilbur whispered, his voice hoarse. Phil nodded. It is. Heart pounding in his ears, Wilbur took another breath to try and force the words out. What am I to you then? For a moment, Phil was silent. For a moment, Wilbur couldn't feel Tommy's hand gripping his own. For a moment, nothing else existed in the universe except the two of them. I've never been a parental person, Phil began, eyes falling to the ground. I never wanted children. I liked kids all right, but that just wasn't something I ever considered for myself. I never thought of myself as a father to anyone, and I figured that if I was, I'd be a pretty shit one. He paused, eyes flickering up to meet Wilbur's again. Then I met you. The burning was back. It was back, and Wilbur was struggling to keep himself from falling apart. When I first realized how attached I was getting to you, I got scared. I'm not the sort of man to make attachments easily, because I know all the ways those things can be used against you. So I tried to push that all away, and told myself I just saw you as a protege, someone with potential I could mold into something great. Phil blinked, his brows furrowed like it was a battle to admit any of this. It was getting harder and harder to lie to myself, though. Not to mention, Techno kept calling me out my bullshit the more I pushed it. You suck at lying, and we both know it, Techno huffed. Phil rolled his eyes. Maybe he's right. It certainly wasn't fucking working, but I kept trying to avoid it. His face then took on a somber note. Then you and Theseus left. The guilt, the oil-slick guilt that twisted in his gut the night they left was back, making Wilbur nauseous as he watched Phil take a breath to steady himself. Being a parent is fucking terrifying, he admitted. I know that now. Because even though I was proud of you for your voice, the minute I learned Dream had taken you, that he'd taken my son. I don't know if I've ever been that scared in my entire life. There it was. It was real. The very thing Wilbur had been too terrified to put into words was real. Phil saw him as a son. Suddenly, Phil was stretching a hand out between them again. His talons were still stained with Dream's blood, the same talons that had gently brushed the bruises on his face from his fight with Quackity, the same talons that traced circles into the back of his neck when he was upset. If you let me, I could give you the galaxy, Orpheus. This was the choice. Leave for an outer sector planet. Spend the rest of their days completely free of their burdens. No politics, no birthrights. Just him and Tommy, always together. Or they could stay. They would still be together, and they could both be more. Wilbur looked down at Tommy, who was still pressed into his side. Techno had a hand resting on his shoulder, and he seemed to be leaning into it just as much as he was leaning into Wilbur. They locked eyes, and Wilbur asked a silent question. What do you want to do? Tommy blinked, a strange calm washing over him. He squeezed Wilbur's hand, and Wilbur knew what his answer would be without it needing to be said out loud. I'll follow you anywhere. This was Wilbur's decision to make. He looked back at Phil's outstretched hand, at those deadly, blood-stained hands, the gentle hands of a father. Phil said he was already great and just had to let himself be. Phil wanted to see him take more than what fate offered him. Phil was offering him the galaxy. Wilbur just needed the ambition to take it. And Wilbur, he wanted to be ambitious. He wanted to have power. He wanted to be more. Wilbur, he whispered, putting his free hand into Phil's. Call me Wilbur. Phil smiled, and it was the same one he saw in the hangar. One full of pride and love. Wilbur, Phil repeated in an almost odd whisper. The last piece holding the dam together cracked, and Wilbur fell apart. Without thinking, he threw himself onto Phil, the burning finally reaching its peak as tears flowed down his cheeks. Without any hesitation, Phil wrapped his arms around him, holding him tight as his wings arched above them like a shield. Tommy was still attached to his side, and Wilbur used one arm to hug his little brother, and the other to hug his father. It's okay, Will, Phil reassured him, rubbing his hand up and down his back. It's over now. You're both safe. I got you. All at once, he was hit with the realization of just how close he'd come to death. A few seconds too late, and he would have bled out on the floor. He wouldn't have seen Phil again. He wouldn't have realized that he could actually have all of it. Those things he was too afraid to even admit he wanted. More sobs forced their way out of his throat. He buried his face in Phil's shoulder, distantly feeling Tommy detach himself from his side as Phil wrapped him in his wings completely. He looked up for a moment and saw Techno whispering to Tommy, their foreheads pressed together and hands gripped tightly between each other. But then, Tommy caught his eye and gave him an almost imperceptible nod. That he was okay. They were both okay. Wilbur wasn't sure how long he sat on the floor like that, sobbing into Phil's shoulder while Phil whispered his name over and over to remind him he was all right. Eventually, though, the tears dried up, and the rest of his panic did too. He pulled away from Phil's shoulder, his eyes swollen and red as could be. Little bird, Phil murmured. I'm so glad you're all right. Wilbur sniffled. Thanks to you. Phil snorted. I suppose that's true. I would tell you off for how stupid deciding to run away was, but I think you figured that part out already. Yeah, Wilbur nodded, face falling. I know. Brows furrowing, Phil buried his face in Wilbur's hair, an unsteady breath rattling through his lungs. It's okay. It's all okay now. For some reason, it sounded like Phil was trying to tell himself that more than Wilbur. After sitting like that for another few minutes in silence, Phil opened up his wings and helped Wilbur to his feet. He stumbled a bit, legs still shaky after everything, but he got his footing after a moment. As soon as he was upright, Tommy was pressed against his side. Wilbur grabbed his hand again, despite how sore his was already. It was definitely going to bruise. And when he looked down at his little brother, he noticed a small drop of dried blood on his throat, a place where Dream had pressed just a little too hard. Even though there were no tears left inside him, his eyes burned again, and he quickly pressed a kiss to the top of Tommy's head. He'd gotten so close to losing him. Way too fucking close. He glanced up and found himself locking eyes with Techno. There was understanding in the gold, and Wilbur remembered the fury in his voice when Dream threatened to slit Tommy's throat. Wilbur nodded at Techno, a silent thanks. Techno nodded back. An understanding had passed between them. Tommy coughed once, his words rough despite not even having used his voice. So what happens now? Are they still fighting outside, or... The fighting ended a little while ago, Techno told them, making his way down the steps towards the throne room doors. But we do have one thing we need to do before we can really get things moving. The throne room doors creaked open. Puffy walked in, dragging a bound and gagged Dream along with her. He was hunched over, bright green eyes filled with unbridled rage as he sat between the four men in the room. Phil rested a hand on the back of Wilbur's neck. Tommy was still attached to his side, refusing to let go of him again. On Tommy's other side, Techno had a hand on his shoulder. "What do you guys want to do with him?" Puffy asked, pushing Dream's shoulders so he was kneeling on the ground. "Well," Phil said, smirking at Wilbur, "I think you two get the right to decide what happens to him, considering he tried to kill you and all." They had the leader of the Asempi Empire tied up and gagged at their feet. The fighting had ended, but things were still settling. Anything could happen in the chaos of an invasion like that, even to an emperor. Wilbur looked at Tommy again. This was a decision they had to make together. The icy flames were back in Tommy's eyes, burning low but bright as he glanced between Wilbur and Dream, absently rubbing at the mark on his throat. Then, he looked up at Wilbur and gave a small nod. Again, Wilbur knew exactly what Tommy was telling him, even without words. And he was relieved, because he had been thinking the exact same thing. He looked back at Dream. He looked at the man who had invaded their planet, who tormented their nightmares for months, who called him a bug and taunted them over and over and over again. He looked at the monster who held a dagger to his throat, and then to his little brother's throat. The waves were back. The salt water was in his lungs, and it wasn't drowning him anymore. He let the anger swell, rising up inside of him more and more until he could feel it in his throat. The anger he'd pressed down his entire life. The anger Phil had told him to use. Wilbur knew what he wanted to do with Dream. "I want his fucking head." Before you get mad in the comments, Nikki is going to appear in the epilogue. Okay, good. Ah, man. I am so happy with how that ended. Obviously, we still have the epilogue to read, but it's not out yet, so... we're just gonna have to wait for that one. And I don't know how long the epilogue is gonna be. So if it's short, the next stream that I do reading it, I might do something else afterwards. But until then, I think that is going to be my stream. This was really good. This was a really good chapter. I got this close to crying. Like at the end. Man, oh man. But yeah, thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this, be sure to leave a follow. Any follow is appreciated. And if you want to see me play Omori, I have a sub goal. I'm just saying. Help a broke college student out. Obviously, you don't have to. I'm just teasing. But if you want to follow my other socials, the Discord server link is expired, and I don't want to fix it right now, but I will at some point. Yeah. Now that I'm back up in college and classes are going to start up on Monday, I don't know how often I'm going to stream, especially when next Monday I'm going to be having a job as well. I don't know how often I'm going to be able to stream. I mean, I never am, but it's most likely going to be less often than it was last semester. And that's saying something. Because I only stream like once a week then. But yeah. I just hope that you guys stick around. Because I really like streaming. Alright. Thank you all so much for watching. And I'll see you next time.